Perhaps you still remember the feeling of holding that small cartridge in your hands, wondering what adventures awaited inside its quiet circuits. There was something almost magical about those early mornings or late evenings, the soft glow illuminating your face as you stepped into worlds woven from pixels and imagination. Tonight, we're drifting through the entire history of Pokémon, from the first gentle footsteps in Kanto to the vast horizons of Paldea, wandering through each generation as it unfolded across nearly 3 decades. This isn't a race through facts or a hurried tour of regions. This is a slow journey, a meditation on how these worlds grew and changed, how they shaped our childhoods, and continue to whisper to us even now. Let your mind settle as we explore the quiet corners of memory, the hidden details that made each generation feel like home. Before you drift off, maybe tap subscribe for more relaxing videos, and tell me where you're watching from tonight. The story begins not with a grand announcement or a massive marketing campaign, but with something far more intimate and personal. It begins with a young man named Satoshi Tajiri wandering through the fields and ponds of suburban Tokyo, collecting insects with careful hands and curious eyes. His friends called him Mr. Bug, and he spent countless hours studying beetles, butterflies, and the tiny creatures that inhabited the natural spaces around his childhood home. These were his treasures, his companions, his gateway to understanding the living world. But as the years passed and Tokyo modernized, those green spaces began to vanish beneath concrete and steel. The fields where he once hunted for rare beetles became parking lots. The ponds where dragonflies danced were filled in and paved over. Tajiri felt a profound sense of loss, not just for himself, but for future generations who would never know the joy of discovering life in the wild spaces between buildings. This feeling became the seed for something extraordinary, a way to preserve that sense of wonder and discovery in a form that could never be bulldozed or developed. He imagined a world where children could still experience the thrill of finding rare creatures, where they could collect and trade them, where they could build communities around shared fascination, not in disappearing fields, but in a digital realm that would remain constant and accessible. This vision took years to materialize, countless hours of programming and designing, refining and reimagining. Game Freak, the small company Tajiri founded, poured everything into this project, working with limited resources and even more limited faith from publishers who couldn't see the potential in what seemed like a simple collecting game. The development of the first Pokémon games took nearly 6 years, an eternity in the fast-moving world of video game development. The team faced constant technical challenges, working with the limited memory of Game Boy cartridges, trying to fit an entire world of creatures and locations into incredibly small digital spaces. There were moments when the project seemed doomed, when funding dried up and team members left, when it appeared the vision would never become reality. But Tajiri persisted, driven by that childhood memory of discovery, that desire to give other children something permanent they could hold on to. When Pokémon Red and Green finally released in Japan on February 27th, 1996, the initial response was quiet, almost cautious. Sales were modest in those first weeks. Reviews were mixed with critics unsure what to make of this collecting game, and many industry observers predicted the games would fade quickly into obscurity like countless other Game Boy titles before them. The initial print run was conservative, publishers uncertain whether the game would find an audience in an increasingly crowded portable gaming market. But something unexpected happened in schoolyards and playgrounds across Japan, something that couldn't have been predicted or manufactured. Children began connecting their Game Boys with link cables, those gray cords that turned solitary devices into bridges between worlds. Trading creatures became a ritual during lunch breaks. Battling each other transformed recesses into tournaments, and sharing secrets and strategies created the informal networks of knowledge that spread from school to school. Players discovered that certain Pokémon were version exclusive, that trading was necessary to complete the Pokédex, that cooperation was built into the game's very structure. This social element transformed Pokémon from a single player adventure into a community experience, from an individual pursuit into a shared journey. Word spread organically through these peer networks, carried by excitement and genuine enthusiasm rather than expensive advertising campaigns. A child who caught a rare Dratini would tell friends, those friends would seek their own, and the cycle would continue. Urban legends emerged about finding Mew under trucks or using specific button combinations to evolve Pokémon in special ways. These myths, even when false, added to the mystique and encouraged experimentation. The games became a phenomenon not through traditional marketing, but through the simple joy of sharing discoveries with friends, of having something to talk about and trade and compete over. The sales trajectory reflected this grassroots growth. Within months, Pokémon had become one of the best-selling Game Boy titles in Japan, demand far exceeding initial expectations. Nintendo and Game Freak scrambled to increase production, to meet orders that seemed to multiply daily. The phenomenon had begun quietly, but was gaining unstoppable momentum, fueled by word of mouth and the intrinsic appeal of collecting, trading, and battling. By the end of its first year, Pokémon Red and Green had sold over 10 million copies in Japan alone, numbers that seemed impossible for what had been a risky bet on an unusual concept. The roster of 151 creatures that populated Kanto was deliberately diverse, each Pokémon designed with careful thought about what would appeal to different types of players with different sensibilities and playstyles. The design philosophy drew from Ken Sugimori's artistic vision combined with Tajiri's biological understanding, creating creatures that felt like they could exist in a coherent ecosystem while remaining fantastical and impossible. There were undeniably cute companions like Pikachu, whose round cheeks and innocent eyes made it instantly lovable even before the anime elevated it to mascot status. Eevee represented potential and choice, a normal-type Pokémon that could evolve into 3 different elemental forms depending on which stone was used. This branching evolution path suggested that identity was shaped by circumstances and choices rather than predetermined by birth. Players agonized over which evolution to pursue, knowing that choosing one meant forgoing the others unless they traded for additional Eevees. There were fierce dragons like Dragonite and Charizard, powerful creatures that felt like rewards for patient training and careful team building. Dragonite required leveling a Dragonair to 55, a significant time investment that made finally achieving that evolution deeply satisfying. The creature's friendly appearance contrasted with its devastating power, embodying the idea that strength and kindness weren't mutually exclusive. Charizard, meanwhile, became arguably the most iconic Pokémon besides Pikachu, its fire-flying typing and impressive stats making it a formidable battler, while its dragon-like appearance captured imaginations even though it wasn't actually dragon-type. There were mysterious psychic types like Alakazam and Mewtwo, creatures whose mental powers seemed almost supernatural compared to physical fighters. Alakazam required trading to obtain, as Kadabra only evolved into its final form through link cable exchange. This evolution method encouraged social interaction, made Alakazam feel special, because obtaining it required another person's cooperation. Mewtwo represented the pinnacle of power in Generation 1, a legendary Pokémon created through unethical genetic experiments whose existence raised questions about scientific responsibility and the ethics of creating life for human purposes. Each creature had its own personality, expressed through minimal sprite animation and Pokedex descriptions that sparked imagination. A Cubone, wearing its dead mother's skull, became a tragic figure whose story players invented elaborate backstories for. Magikarp's reputation as the weakest Pokemon made its evolution into the fearsome Gyarados all the more satisfying, teaching patience and the value of persistence through apparent weakness. Ditto's ability to transform into any other Pokemon made mysterious and useful, a shapeshifter whose true form remained uncertain. Each Pokemon occupied its own niche in the ecosystem of battles and strategies, from walls like Chansey, with enormous HP, to glass cannons like Gengar, with high special attack but poor physical defense. Players formed bonds with their teams that went beyond statistical optimization, choosing favorites not just for power, but for design, for the stories they imagined about their Pokemon's personalities, for the memories attached to specific captures or clutch victories in important battles. A Pokemon that landed a critical hit to win a tough gym battle became more than data. It became a hero whose contribution would be remembered. The iconic locations of Kanto became etched in collective memory through countless hours of exploration and the distinct atmosphere each area created despite technical limitations. Pallet Town established itself as the archetypal beginning, a small community with only a few houses where every trainer's journey started. The name itself, referencing a painter's palette, suggested a blank canvas ready to be filled with adventure and experience. Professor Oak's lab dominated the town, a place where science and dreams intersected, where young trainers received their first partner Pokémon and their first glimpse of the wider world awaiting them. Viridian Forest served as the first real test for most trainers, a maze of trees where wild Pokémon waited in tall grass, and bug catchers challenged anyone who passed. The forest has taught patience and resource management, as Pokémon centers were far away and healing items were scarce. Catching a Pikachu here felt special, finding that yellow electric mouse among the common Caterpie and Weedle, seeing its lightning bolt tail appear in the grass. The forest also introduced players to status conditions, as Weedle's poison sting could leave Pokémon poisoned, their health slowly draining as they walked. Pewter City, with its rock-type gym and stern gym leader Brock, introduced players to the gym challenge structure, teaching the importance of type matchups through Brock's Geodude and Onix that resisted normal attacks and required water or grass moves to defeat efficiently. The Pewter Museum of Science hinted at Kanto's deeper history, displaying fossils that could be revived into ancient Pokémon at Cinnabar Island's laboratory. This connection between locations suggested that Kanto was more than just a collection of discrete areas, that these places had relationships and shared history spanning millions of years. Mount Moon's caverns represented the first major dungeon, a dark maze where trainers needed flash to see clearly, but could navigate through darkness if they chose to conserve a move slot. The cave was filled with Zubat, those ubiquitous bat Pokémon that seemed to appear every few steps, teaching players about encounter rates and the value of repels. Deep within the mountain, trainers could find fossils, choosing between the Helix fossil that would become Omanite or the Dome fossil that would become Kabuto. This choice, though relatively minor, made players feel ownership over their adventure, that their decisions shaped their unique experience. Cerulean City, with its mysterious cave and elusive Mewtwo, became synonymous with endgame content and the ultimate challenge. The cave itself couldn't be accessed until late in the adventure, requiring proof of championship status before the guards would allow entry. Inside, the darkness and high level wild Pokemon created an atmosphere of danger and excitement, a place where even experienced trainers needed to proceed carefully. Finding Mewtwo at the deepest point of the cave felt like uncovering a terrible secret, discovering the result of experiments that should never have been conducted. The battle itself was challenging, Mewtwo's level 70 power and excellent stats making it difficult to capture without preparation, strategy, and usually a significant quantity of Ultra Balls. Vermilion City introduced the SS Anne, a luxury cruise ship where trainers could battle wealthy passengers and eventually receive the HM cut from the ship's captain after curing his seasickness. The ship represented temporary opportunity, as it left port after the captain was helped and could never be revisited in most versions. This created urgency and encouraged thorough exploration before progressing, a lesson about examining every room and talking to every NPC. The city also housed the third gym, led by Lieutenant Surge, whose Raichu was significantly higher level than previous gym leaders' Pokémon, teaching players that difficulty would increase as they progressed. Lavender Town, with its haunting music and ghostly inhabitants, left impressions that lingered long after the Game Boy was turned off, creating genuine unease through nothing more than minor key melody and purple-tinted sprites. The Pokemon Tower served as a cemetery where trainers buried their deceased companions, a somber acknowledgement that death existed even in this fantastical world. Ghost-type Pokemon haunted the tower, including the spirit of a Marowak, whose child wandered the world below wearing her skull as a helmet. This tragic story added emotional weight to what could have been just another dungeon to explore, suggesting that Pokemon were more than just tools for battling. The ghost-type Pokemon in the tower couldn't be identified or caught without the Sylph Scope, a special device that revealed their true forms. Before obtaining this item, ghost Pokemon appeared only as distorted sprites, their forms shifting and unclear, adding to the tower's unsettling atmosphere. This mechanical limitation became narrative strength, the inability to interact with ghosts, properly reinforcing their otherworldly nature. When the Sylph Scope was finally obtained through the Rocket Hideout mission, returning to clear the tower felt like righting a wrong, helping spirits find peace. Saffron City represented urban density and the convergence of power, hosting both the Fighting Dojo, where players could receive a choice between Hitmonlee and Hitmonchan, and the Sylph Company building, where Team Rocket's takeover reached its climax. The city felt important in ways that smaller towns didn't, its central location and multiple points of interest making it a hub that players returned to repeatedly throughout their journey. The Sylph Company raid required navigating 11 floors, using teleportation panels to reach different areas, battling Rocket members throughout while searching for the president held hostage. The Psychic Gym, led by Sabrina, presented one of the game's toughest challenges, her high-level Alakazam capable of sweeping unprepared teams. The teleportation puzzles in Saffron's gym tested spatial reasoning in ways other gym challenges didn't, requiring players to think differently about navigation and problem-solving. Success required either a strong dark or ghost-type Pokemon, though ghost types in Generation 1 were weak to psychic due to a programming error that contradicted the intended type chart, or simply overleveling until brute force carried the day. Celadon City sprawled as Kanto's largest metropolis, featuring a massive department store where players could purchase items unavailable elsewhere, a game corner where slot machines and prize exchanges offered rare Pokémon like Porygon, and a restaurant where trainers could battle for experience. The city felt alive with activity, NPCs going about their business, shops offering goods and services. Hidden within was Team Rocket's hideout beneath the game corner, accessed through a secret switch that revealed stairs to an underground base. The labyrinthine hideout culminated in a battle with Giovanni, the team's leader, who would later be revealed as the final gym leader as well. The grass gym led by Erica presented a different kind of challenge, as grass types were common, and many players had fire or flying types capable of exploiting the weakness. Her Vileplume's high special stats still posed threats with powerful poison and grass moves, teaching that type advantage alone wasn't always sufficient. The gym itself was beautifully designed, a garden temple that reflected Erica's connection to nature and plants. The aesthetic matched the leader's team, creating cohesion between character and environment. Foskia City introduced the Safari Zone, a special area where normal catching mechanics didn't apply. Instead of battling wild Pokémon to weaken them, trainers threw bait or rocks to influence catch rates, while Pokémon might flee at any moment. The Safari Zone's unique catching mechanics created tension and frustration in equal measure. The possibility of encountering rare Pokémon like Chansey or Scyther balanced against the high likelihood of them escaping before being caught. The time and step limits added pressure, forcing efficient exploration and quick decision-making about which Pokémon were worth pursuing. The city's gym leader, Koga, specialized in poison types, using toxic and other status moves to wear down opponents gradually. His ninja-themed gym featured invisible walls that players needed to navigate through trial and error, memorizing the correct path or using methodical exploration to map the maze. The combination of frustrating navigation and status-heavy battles made this gym memorable for both its challenge and its gimmick, teaching players to prepare appropriate counters and healing items. Cinnabar Island represented scientific ambition and its consequences, home to the Pokémon Mansion, where the journals detailing Mewtwo's creation could be found. The mansion was in ruins, abandoned after the experiment went wrong, haunted by fire-type Pokémon that had made the wreckage their home. Reading the journal entries painted a disturbing picture of scientific hubris, the excitement of early progress giving way to horror as Mewtwo proved uncontrollable. The final entry's stark admission of failure and destruction created narrative context for Mewtwo's existence, explaining why such a powerful Pokémon lived alone in a cave rather than among other creatures. The lab on the island could revive fossils obtained at Mount Moon and elsewhere, turning ancient remains into living Pokémon through technology that seemed miraculous. Kabuto, Omanite, and Aerodactyl represented extinct species brought back to life, raising questions about whether reviving extinct creatures was ethical or advisable. These resurrected Pokémon had rock typing, their fossilized nature reflected in their battle capabilities and their heavy, ancient aesthetic. The gym leader Blaine tested trainers with fire-type Pokémon and quiz machines that unlocked doors when answered correctly. The questions tested knowledge of Pokémon and game mechanics, rewarding players who paid attention to Pokédex entries and NPC dialogue. Blaine himself was characterized as a scientist who had perhaps worked at the mansion before its destruction, his presence on the island suggesting connections to the experiments that created Mewtwo, though this was never explicitly confirmed. Viridian City's gym, locked at the beginning of the game, finally opened after obtaining 7 badges. Giovanni, revealed to be both Team Rocket's leader and the eighth gym leader, represented the final obstacle before challenging the Elite Four. His ground-type team featured powerful Pokémon like Rhyhorn and Dugtrio, requiring water or grass moves to exploit weaknesses. Defeating him completed the gym challenge and effectively ended Team Rocket's operations in Kanto, the leader disbanding the organization after his loss. This narrative resolution tied together plot threads that had woven through the entire adventure. Victory Road stood as the final gauntlet, a cave system filled with strong trainers and powerful wild Pokémon that tested whether teams were truly ready for the Elite Four. The cave required using strength to move boulders, navigating multiple floors with careful attention to avoid getting lost. Emerging from Victory Road's exit led to the Indigo Plateau, the Pokemon League headquarters, where the Elite Four and Champion awaited. This transition from dark cave to grand building created a sense of arrival, of reaching the culmination of a long journey. These places weren't just locations on a map serving as waypoints between battles. They were characters in their own right, each with its own story to tell, each contributing to Kanto's identity as a region. They felt real despite being constructed from simple graphics, felt lived in through NPC dialogue and environmental storytelling, felt full of secrets waiting to be discovered by trainers willing to explore thoroughly and talk to every person they encountered. The sense of place these locations created became part of Pokemon's appeal, the feeling that you were adventuring through a coherent world rather than progressing through disconnected levels. Kanto itself became as iconic as the creatures that inhabited it. Pallet Town, with its quiet beginnings, Viridian Forest, where so many trainers caught their first Caterpie or Weedle, Mount Moon, with its maze-like caves and mysterious fossils. Lavender Town's haunting music and ghostly atmosphere left impressions that lingered long after the Game Boy was turned off. Each location had character. Each gym presented unique challenges. Each route offered new discoveries. The world felt lived in, despite its technical limitations, felt real despite being constructed from simple sprites and limited color palettes. The turn-based battle system was deceptively simple on the surface but revealed profound depth for those who looked closer. Type advantages created a rock-paper-scissors complexity that extended across 18 different types, each with strengths and weaknesses that needed to be memorized and understood. Building a balanced team required thought and planning, required an understanding not just of individual Pokemon, but how they worked together. Casual players could succeed with favorites and brute force, but serious trainers needed to think strategically about coverage, about movesets, about the intricate dance of prediction and counter-prediction that defined competitive battles. When Pokémon reached North America and Europe in 1998, rebranded as Pokémon Red and Blue, the response was immediate and overwhelming. The anime was already airing, the trading cards were already in stores, and the cultural groundwork had been carefully laid. Children everywhere suddenly wanted to be trainers, wanted to catch them all, wanted to experience the world that Ash Ketchum explored every Saturday morning. Pikachu became a household name, Charizard cards became precious treasures, and the phrase "gotta catch 'em all" became a mantra that defined a generation's relationship with collecting and completion. The impact extended far beyond video games. Pokemon became a multimedia empire, a cultural force that influenced fashion, music, language, and social behavior. Playgrounds developed economies based on trading cards, with complex hierarchies of value and rarity. Friendships formed around shared interest in training and battling. Parents who had never understood video games found themselves drawn into their children's enthusiasm, learning type matchups and evolution methods. The phenomenon crossed generational boundaries, proving that the appeal of collecting, discovering, and sharing transcended age. As we drift a little deeper tonight, consider how those first experiences shaped everything that followed. The foundation laid in Kanto established patterns and expectations that would guide the franchise for decades. The formula of choosing a starter, collecting 8 badges, defeating an elite group of powerful trainers, and eventually facing a champion became a structure that future games would build upon and occasionally challenge. But more than mechanics or story beats, those first games established an emotional template, a feeling of wonder and possibility that each new generation would attempt to recapture in its own way. The success also created pressure, enormous expectations for what would come next. Could Game Freak expand the world without losing what made it special? Could they add new creatures without diluting the magic of the original roster? Could they innovate without alienating fans who loved the simplicity of what already existed? These questions hung over the development of the second generation, creating both opportunity and challenge. Johto emerged as the answer to those questions, a region that honored tradition while embracing innovation. Released in Japan in 1999 for the Game Boy Color, Pokémon Gold and Silver represented both continuity and evolution. The new region felt deliberately different from Kanto, steeped in Japanese tradition and mythology rather than the more generalized landscape of the first games. Ancient towers dominated the skyline, shrines dotted the countryside, and the architecture suggested a culture that revered its past while moving carefully into the future. The visual upgrade to full color transformed the experience in subtle but profound ways. Suddenly, the world had vibrancy. Different times of day painted the landscape in different hues, and Pokemon's sprites gained personality through color palettes that made each creature feel more distinct. The grass was properly green, the water actually blue, and the fire that surrounded Typhlosion crackled with orange and yellow intensity. These weren't just aesthetic improvements. They fundamentally changed how players perceived and connected with the world. Perhaps the most revolutionary addition was the introduction of a day and night cycle that made the world feel genuinely alive in ways the static Game Boy games couldn't achieve. The world changed based on the actual time you played, morning sunlight giving way to afternoon shadows, evening twilight fading into nighttime darkness. Certain Pokemon only appeared at specific times, creating incentive to play at different hours or adjust the internal clock to hunt for nocturnal creatures. Trainers offered different dialogue depending on whether you encountered them in sunlight or darkness, acknowledging the passage of time in their comments about sleep schedules and daily routines. This temporal element created living feeling, a sense that the world existed and evolved even when you weren't playing. It encouraged players to return at different times, to explore familiar routes under different conditions, to discover secrets that only revealed themselves during specific hours. Hoothoot and Spinarak appeared at night, while Ladybug and Pidgey dominated daytime encounters, teaching players that time of day mattered for completing the Pokédex. Some trainers would call your Pokégear phone at specific times, asking for rematches or sharing tips, creating the impression of ongoing relationships rather than static NPCs waiting to be interacted with. The Pokégear itself represented innovation in how players navigated and connected with the world. The device combined phone functionality with radio and map features, creating a multi-purpose tool that felt more advanced than anything in Generation 1. Trainers could register phone numbers, receiving calls about Pokemon sightings or rematch requests. The radio played different stations, including a Pokemon lullaby channel that affected the wild encounters and a program about rare Pokemon appearances. The map showed your current location and could display information about different routes and towns, making navigation easier while maintaining the sense of exploration that made getting lost part of the adventure. Johto introduced 100 new Pokemon that expanded the universe while maintaining the design philosophy that made the originals so appealing and memorable. The new starters, Chikorita, Cyndaquil, and Totodile, offered different personality profiles and strategic options compared to Kanto's choices. Chikorita embodied cheerful optimism with its leaf and sweet scent, evolving into Bayleaf and eventually Meganium, whose design suggested grace and healing. Cyndaquil's timid appearance belied its potential, flames erupting from its back when evolving into Quilava and fully manifesting into Typhlosion's fierce heat. Totodile's playful aggression evolved into Croconaws' teenage ferocity and Feraligatter's powerful jaws that could crush anything. Baby Pokemon like Pichu, Cleffa, Igglybuff, and Togepi added evolutionary stages below existing creatures, suggesting that the world of Pokemon was more complex and interconnected than previously understood. These adorable pre-evolutions couldn't be found in the wild, only obtained through breeding, creating gameplay incentives for the new breeding system, while also making biological sense that young creatures would be protected by parents rather than wandering alone. The baby Pokemon designs emphasized cuteness to the extreme, large eyes and small bodies, creating instant appeal for players who preferred adorable companions over powerful battlers. The legendary guardians, Ho-Oh and Lugia, brought gravitas and mythology to Johto, representing hope and the seas respectively, their designs pulling from Eastern symbolism and folklore that felt appropriate for the region's cultural foundation. Ho-Oh appeared in the game's opening, flying across a golden sky, its rainbow wings catching light before vanishing. This early appearance created mystery that wouldn't be resolved until much later, when trainers could encounter it atop the bell tower in Ekritique City after obtaining the Rainbow Wing. The encounter felt earned through exploration and understanding of Johto's legends, through respecting the sacred nature of the tower and the history it represented. Lugia, meanwhile, slumbered in the Whirl Islands, its presence causing storms and rough seas that made the area dangerous for travelers. The legend spoke of a guardian who calmed the three legendary birds when their conflicts threatened the world, positioning Lugia as a mediator rather than aggressor. Encountering it required navigating through caves and water routes, reaching the deepest chamber where the great beast rested. The battle showcased Lugia's incredible defensive stats, its psychic and flying typing creating interesting coverage that made it different from other legendary encounters. Capturing it felt like awakening something ancient and powerful that should perhaps remain sleeping. The introduction of Dark and Steel types fundamentally altered the battle metagame that had existed since Red and Blue, addressing imbalances that had plagued competitive play in the first generation and creating new strategic possibilities. The Dark type gave trainers tools to counter the previously dominant Psychic types with immunity to psychic attacks and super effectiveness against both Psychic and Ghost types. This single addition dramatically changed the competitive landscape, making Pokémon like Alakazam and Mewtwo less overwhelming, while elevating Dark types like Umbreon, Tyranitar, and Houndoom to prominence. Steel types brought defensive strategies to new heights with their impressive resistance chart that included immunity to poison and resistance to numerous attacking types. Steelix, Scizor, and Skarmory could wall physical attacks or set up entry hazards while shrugging off most attacks that would devastate normal defensive Pokémon. The Steel typing also gave weaknesses to fire and fighting attacks that were relatively uncommon in competitive play, making Steel types excellent defensive pivots that forced opponents to carry specific coverage moves or struggle to break through their defenses. These weren't just new options added for variety, they were corrections that made the type chart more balanced and strategic battles more complex and interesting. Umbreon became a defensive wall with high special defense and access to Toxic and Moonlight for recovery, outstalling opponents through careful play. Tyranitar combined Dark and Rock typing with pseudo-legendary stats, creating a fierce physical attacker that could take hits and dish out devastating damage. Scizor's Bug and Steel combination eliminated the usual Bug-type weaknesses while giving it priority moves and Technician-boosted attacks that made it a constant threat. But perhaps the most significant innovation was Pokemon breeding, a system that added layers of depth for players who wanted to engage more seriously with team building and competitive preparation. Suddenly, your Pokemon weren't just caught wild creatures with random stats, they were capable of creating new life through the daycare system. The old man in daycare on Route 34 became a hub of excitement, a place where trainers could experiment with different combinations, hoping to hatch eggs that might contain perfectly trained competitors or rare baby Pokemon. The breeding mechanics were discovered gradually, players learning through experimentation which Pokemon could breed together, which egg groups existed, how gender ratios affected breeding success. A female Charizard, bred with a male Feraligatr, would produce a Charmander egg, the species determined by the mother, while moves could be inherited from the father. This opened possibilities for move combinations impossible through normal level up or TM teaching, allowing Pokemon to learn egg moves that gave them unique advantages in battle. The hidden world of individual values and effort values that had existed but been invisible in Generation 1 became somewhat more accessible through breeding, as players could produce multiple offspring and compare their stats to find superior specimens. This system transformed casual catching into something approaching animal husbandry, creating a hobby within a hobby for players who wanted to master every aspect of the game. Competitive players could spend hours at the daycare waiting for eggs, then hours more hatching and releasing inferior offspring while searching for that perfect Pokemon with ideal stats and moves. The held item system gave each Pokemon the ability to carry an item into battle, creating strategic choices about whether to boost power with charcoal or never melt ice, cure status with berries, or provide longevity with leftovers that gradually restored HP. Some items like Thick Club or Light Ball dramatically boosted specific Pokemon's stats, turning Marowak and Pikachu into serious threats rather than cute companions. Others provided utility, like Focus Band that occasionally prevented one-hit knockouts, or Scope Lens that increased critical hit ratios. Berries grew on special trees planted throughout Johto, renewable resources that players could harvest daily and replant to maintain supplies. Different berries cured different status conditions or restored HP, creating an alternative to purchasing expensive full heals or hyper potions. The berry system encouraged daily play, checking on trees to see if fruit was ripe, watering them if necessary, creating routines that integrated with the day-night cycle to make the world feel more like a place with natural rhythms rather than a static game environment. The friendship system tracked how Pokemon felt about their trainers, rising through use in battle and walking with the trainer, falling through fainting or bitter medicine use. High friendship unlocked evolution for Pokemon like Eevee into Espeon during day or Umbreon at night, Golbat into Crobat, and Chansey into Blissey. This invisible stat encouraged treating Pokemon well, creating mechanical incentive for the emotional bonds the games and anime emphasized. Players could visit a woman in Goldenrod City who would check friendship levels, providing cryptic but helpful information about how their Pokemon felt. The special types it introduced with breeding and held items combined with existing mechanics to create vastly more complex team-building possibilities than Generation 1 had offered. Players needed to consider not just which Pokemon to use, but which items they should hold, which moves they should breed for, how friendship affected certain evolutions, how time of day influenced encounter rates and evolution options. This layering of systems provided depth without overwhelming, as casual players could ignore most complexity, while competitive players could spend countless hours optimizing every detail. Perhaps the most revolutionary addition was the introduction of a day and night cycle, something that seems simple now, but felt magical then. The world changed based on the time you played. Certain Pokemon only appeared at specific times. Trainers offered different dialogue depending on whether you encountered them in sunlight or darkness. This created a living feeling, a sense that the world existed and evolved even when you weren't playing. It encouraged players to return at different times, to explore familiar routes under different conditions, to discover secrets that only revealed themselves at specific hours. Johto introduced 100 new Pokemon, creatures that expanded the universe while maintaining the design philosophy that made the originals so appealing. The new starters, Chikorita, Cyndaquil, and Totodile, offered different personality profiles and strategic options. Baby Pokemon, like Pichu and Togepi, added evolutionary stages below existing creatures, suggesting that the world of Pokemon was more complex and interconnected than previously understood. Legendary Guardians, Ho-Oh and Lugia, brought gravitas and mythology, representing hope and the seas respectively, their designs pulling from Eastern symbolism and folklore. The introduction of Dark and Steel types fundamentally altered the battle metagame, addressing imbalances that had plagued competitive play in the first generation. The Dark type gave trainers tools to counter the previously dominant Psychic types, while Steel types brought defensive strategies to new heights. These weren't just new options, they were corrections that made the type chart more balanced and strategic battles more complex. Umbreon became a defensive wall, Tyranitar became a fearsome physical attacker, Scizor combined typing with impressive stats to create something both beautiful and deadly. But perhaps the most significant innovation was Pokemon breeding, a system that added layers of depth for players who wanted to engage more seriously with team building. Suddenly, individual Pokemon weren't just caught, they could be carefully cultivated across generations. Trainers could pass down moves, could pursue optimal stats, could spend hours at the daycare waiting for eggs that might hatch into perfectly trained competitors. This system transformed casual catching into something approaching animal husbandry, creating a hobby within a hobby for players who wanted to master every aspect of the game. If you're still awake halfway through, maybe subscribe before you drift off, and tell me what time it is where you're watching from. Johto's connection to Kanto added another layer of richness to the experience. After defeating the Elite Four and becoming champion of Johto, players discovered they could return to Kanto, seeing how the region had changed in the years since Red and Blue. Familiar locations appeared in new contexts, old gym leaders returned with stronger teams, and the adventure that seemed complete suddenly expanded into something larger. This connected universe approach suggested that the Pokemon world was vast and continuing, that trainers existed in a shared timeline where events in one region influenced others. The rematch with Red atop Mount Silver became legendary among players, a challenging battle against the protagonist of the first games, now a silent hermit training in isolation. This encounter brought the generational connection full circle, suggesting that every player's journey contributed to an ongoing narrative. It honored what came before while establishing the player of Gold and Silver as part of that continuing story. The battle was difficult. Red's team was powerful, and defeating him felt like surpassing a legend, like proving yourself against the idealized version of what every trainer aspired to become. Crystal version, released a year later, added further refinements in the series' first playable female protagonist. This seemingly small addition had profound impact, allowing half the player base to see themselves represented in ways they hadn't been before. The game also introduced the Battle Tower, a structure dedicated to challenging battles outside the main story. giving competitive trainers a venue to test their skills and pursue rewards beyond defeating the Elite Four. These quality of life improvements and additional content established a pattern of third versions that would continue through later generations. As we drift toward the third generation, consider how Johto managed to honor what came before while establishing its own identity. The games could have simply been more of the same, more Kanto with new paint. Instead, they expanded the universe thoughtfully, adding complexity without overwhelming simplicity, introducing new ideas while maintaining core appeal. They proved that Pokémon could grow and change, that the formula had room for innovation, that players would embrace new creatures and new systems if they were implemented with care and intention. The transition to the Game Boy Advance brought both excitement and anxiety. New hardware meant new possibilities, the potential for more complex worlds and deeper systems. But it also meant leaving behind the ability to transfer Pokémon from previous games, a technical limitation that would temporarily sever the connection between generations. When Pokémon Ruby and Sapphire released in 2002 in Japan, they represented a fresh start, a new beginning that would eventually reconnect with the past, but first needed to establish its own identity. Hoenn felt fundamentally different from both Kanto and Johto, a region defined by the interplay between land and sea, between nature and human ambition that would become central to its narrative themes. The tropical climate, the emphasis on water routes that covered nearly half the region, the volcanic mountain ranges that divided the land into distinct areas, all contributed to an atmosphere that felt exotic and adventurous compared to previous regions, more temperate environments. Route 1. 1-9's perpetual rain created unique encounter tables and required careful navigation of tall grass where visibility was reduced by weather effects. The ash-covered grass around Falerbor town showed the influence of nearby volcanic activity, gray snow that fell from the sky and coated everything in fine powder that muffled sounds and created an ethereal atmosphere. The underwater sections that let players explore the ocean floor represented the generation's most ambitious environmental innovation, creating an entirely new dimension for exploration that previous games couldn't achieve with their hardware. Diving beneath the waves revealed hidden areas accessible only to trainers with the Dive HM, secret caves and ruins that existed in the depths far from any land. The darker underwater terrain created an atmosphere of mystery and slight danger, the pressure and darkness of the deep ocean translating into visual design that felt appropriately alien compared to surface areas. Finding treasures and doorways that led to new locations rewarded thorough exploration and mastery of the HM system that some players found tedious, but that created interconnected world design. The legendary conflict at the heart of Ruby and Sapphire's story represented an escalation in narrative ambition compared to previous generations' more subdued legendary encounters. While previous games had legendary Pokémon as optional encounters or minor story elements, here they became central to the plot and region's identity. Groudon and Kyogre, representing land and sea respectively, and embodying the fundamental conflict between expansion of Earth and rising of oceans, were awakened by villainous teams whose goals threatened the entire region with their short-sighted ambition and flawed understanding of balance. Team Magma in Ruby sought to awaken Groudon to expand land masses, believing more land would benefit humanity and Pokémon by providing space for development and growth. Their leader Maxie genuinely believed he was helping, his environmental philosophy prioritizing terra firma over aquatic ecosystems. Team Aqua in Sapphire, meanwhile, pursued awakening Kyogre to expand the oceans, arguing that humans had consumed too much land and that returning area to the sea would restore natural balance. Archie's conviction that more water meant better world for water. Pokemon showed similar environmental concern, twisted by extremism and lack of foresight about consequences. The player's role shifted from passive collector to active hero, whose choices and actions determined whether balance would be restored or chaos would consume everything in catastrophic weather events. This narrative shift raised the stakes, made the legendary encounters feel meaningful beyond simply adding powerful creatures to the roster. When Groudon was awakened, the region experienced drought that threatened to evaporate all water. When Kyogre rose, endless rain began that would flood all land, if not stopped. The Weather Institute's warnings about the intensifying conditions created urgency that previous games' plots had lacked. Rayquaza's role as mediator, available only in Emerald version or after completing specific conditions, positioned the Sky Dragon as balance personified. Its intervention to calm the feuding titans showed that nature provided its own corrections when forces grew too extreme, that balance existed above the binary conflict of land versus sea. Catching Rayquaza atop the Sky Pillar after navigating floors that required mock bike precision to cross crumbling tiles created one of the generation's most memorable moments, the challenge reflecting Rayquaza's status as ultimate arbiter of Hoenn's environmental harmony. Hoenn's Pokemon roster included 135 new species, creatures that reflected the region's tropical climate and maritime culture while pushing design boundaries in interesting directions. The starters embodied different aspects of nature in ways that went beyond simple elemental typing. Trico represented forest, agility and adaptation, its evolution into Grovyle and Sceptile, showcasing speed and special attack that made it an effective sweeper with Leaf Blade's high critical hit rate. Torchic brought fire and fighting spirit in a durable package, evolving into Combusken and Blaziken, whose firefighting combination would become somewhat overused in future generations, but remained fresh and exciting in Generation 3. Mudkip combined water and ground in ways that suggested the adaptation to swampy environments and muddy terrain where land and water intermixed. Its evolution into Marshtomp and Swampert resulted in a bulky Pokemon with excellent defensive typing that resisted electric attacks completely and only had grass as significant weakness. Swampert became fan favorite for both its design and its utility, capable of taking hits while dishing out powerful water and ground attacks that provided excellent coverage against common types. The introduction of abilities added another layer of complexity to battles and team building that would define all future generations' strategic considerations. Each Pokemon now had a passive effect that could influence battles in subtle or dramatic ways, depending on the ability and situation. Intimidate lowered opponents' attack stat on entry, making certain Pokemon like Salamence and Gyarados excellent leads, who weakened physical attackers before they could attack. Sturdy prevented one-hit knockout moves and later one-hit knockouts period, allowing fragile Pokemon like Forretress to survive hits that should have ended them. Rain Dish and similar weather-related abilities interacted with battlefield conditions to provide constant healing or stat boosts, creating synergies between team members and encouraging weather-focused strategies. Chlorophyll doubled speed in harsh sunlight, allowing otherwise slow Pokemon like Victreebel to outspeed opponents and sweep teams. Swift Swim provided similar benefits in rain, enabling Pokemon like Kingdra to become threatening sweepers when water coverage was already dangerous. These abilities encouraged players to think beyond simple type matchups, to consider how different Pokemon supported each other through passive effects, how team composition could create advantages that transcended individual power levels. Weather conditions themselves became central to competitive strategy in ways they hadn't been in previous generations, where weather was mostly aesthetic or temporary. Abilities like Drought and Drizzle automatically set weather upon entry, enabling entire team archetypes built around sunny day or rain strategies that dominated the field as long as weather persisted. Kyogre and Groudon themselves had these abilities, making them not just powerful legendary Pokemon, but enablers of specific playstyles that shaped entire team compositions around weather effects. Sun teams built around chlorophyll sweepers and fire-type attacks boosted by harsh sunlight became common, while rain teams utilizing swift swim attackers and Thunder's perfect accuracy under rain offered alternative aggressive strategy. The secret base system tapped into players' desire for personalization and creativity in ways that previous games' static worlds hadn't allowed. Scattered throughout Hoenn were trees with small openings, indentations and cliffs that led to caves, and hidden spots accessible through specific TMs where players could establish their own bases. Using furniture items collected through purchase or as gifts from NPCs, trainers could decorate these spaces to create personalized hideouts that reflected individual tastes and aesthetic preferences. Some players created cozy bedrooms with plush furniture, others built battle arenas with harsh fluorescent lighting and minimal decoration. Friends could visit these bases via link cable connection or through record mixing, an infrared feature that allowed players to exchange data by holding Game Boy Advances close together. Visiting friends' bases let you see their decoration choices and battle their team's NPC versions in their personalized spaces. This social feature encouraged sharing and comparison, gave players creative outlet beyond simply building strong teams for competitive battles. The decoration possibilities weren't endless, but offered enough variety that bases felt personal and distinct, with players trading furniture items to obtain specific pieces for their ideal designs. Ruby and Sapphire also introduced double battles, encounters where each side used two Pokemon simultaneously rather than the traditional 1 versus 1 format. This seemingly simple variation fundamentally changed battle strategy in profound ways, requiring players to consider not just individual matchups, but how their Pokemon worked together and supported each other. Moves gained new utility in double battles beyond their use in singles. Spread moves like Earthquake and Surf hit multiple targets, including allies, forcing careful positioning and team composition to avoid friendly fire. Support moves could benefit partners, with Helping Hand doubling an ally's attack power or protect shielding one Pokemon while the partner attacked freely. Positioning became important in ways single battles never required, as Pokemon in different positions could be targeted by different moves, and some moves only hit adjacent targets. The complexity of managing two Pokemon simultaneously while predicting opponent moves for both targets created decision trees far more complicated than singles, relatively straightforward choices. The format would eventually become central to official competitive Pokemon through video game championships, but even in its Generation 3 introduction, it added variety and forced players to think differently about team composition and move selection. The Pokemon contests offered an alternative to battling, a way for Pokemon to shine that didn't depend on power or type advantages, but on presentation and performance. Trainers could enter their Pokemon in contests focused on different attributes like coolness, beauty, cuteness, smartness, or toughness. Success depended on teaching Pokemon specific moves that matched the contest category, feeding them Pokeblocks made from blended berries to enhance relevant contest stats, and performing well in the appeal and talent rounds where timing and rhythm mattered more than pure stats. This system acknowledged that not all Pokemon were designed for battle, gave players who preferred collecting and bonding over competitive battling something meaningful to pursue. A Phoebus that was weak in battle could evolve into melodic through maximum beauty stat, rewarding investment in contests rather than just battles. The contests added another dimension to Pokemon raising, encouraged thinking about creatures beyond their battle utility, created space for appreciation of design and aesthetic rather than just competitive viability. The Battle Frontier in Emerald version, released in 2004 in Japan, refined and expanded the Hoenn experience while adding challenging post-game content that pushed even experienced trainers to their limits. 7 different facilities tested different skills and strategies, each with unique rules that prevented relying on a single, overpowered team. The Battle Tower evaluated pure team strength through standard battles against increasingly difficult NPC trainers. The Battle Factory forced players to use rental Pokemon from a random selection, testing ability to build effective teams on the fly with unfamiliar options rather than carefully bred, perfect specimens. The Battle Palace removed direct control, with Pokemon acting according to their nature rather than trainer commands, rewarding knowledge of nature mechanics and team composition that worked autonomously. The Battle Pyramid combined exploration with battles in a dungeon-like structure, where trainers navigated floors while fighting wild Pokemon, and trainers finding items and avoiding traps. The Battle Dome featured tournament-style elimination battles where trainers competed for advancement. The Battle Pike tested luck and intuition through a series of random events and paths that could help or hinder progress. The Battle Arena focused on judgment of performance over 3 turns rather than traditional knockout battles. Each facility offered unique rewards, including rare items, move tutors who taught exclusive moves, and most importantly, battle points that could be exchanged for valuable prizes. Successfully completing facility challenges earned symbols from Frontier Brains, tough opponents who appeared in after win streaks, and tested whether players had truly mastered the facility's unique format. The Frontier provided nearly endless post-game content, challenges that remained relevant even after completing the Pokédex and becoming champion, creating incentives for continued play and team optimization that went far beyond the main story's requirements. As we drift a little deeper tonight, slowly the story continues to widen. The 4th generation represented another leap forward in technology and ambition as Game Freak transitioned from Game Boy Advance to Nintendo DS. The dual screens brought by DS hardware and touch capabilities opened possibilities for interface design and gameplay innovation that hadn't existed before in handheld gaming. When Pokémon Diamond and Pearl released in Japan in September 2006, they took full advantage of this new hardware while deepening the mythological foundations that had been present but understated in previous games' relatively simple narratives about legendary Pokémon. The underwater exploration added a dimension of discovery that previous games couldn't achieve. Diving beneath the waves revealed hidden areas, secret caves, and rare Pokémon that existed in the depths. The mechanic was simple: press a button to descend, explore the darker underwater terrain, find treasures and doorways that led to new locations. But the sense of exploring a hidden world, of discovering places that most trainers would never find, added layers to the adventure. It suggested that even well-traveled routes had secrets, that thorough exploration was always rewarded. Hoenn's Pokémon roster included 135 new species, creatures that reflected the region's tropical climate and maritime culture. The starters embodied different aspects of nature. Trico represented forest agility, Torchic brought fire and fighting spirit, Mudkip combined water and ground in ways that suggested adaptation to swampy environments. These starters evolved into powerful final forms that became fan favorites: Sceptile's speed and special attack, Blaziken's firefighting combination, and Swampert's excellent defensive typing all offered unique strategic advantages. The introduction of abilities added another layer of complexity to battles and team building. Each Pokemon now had a passive effect that could influence battles in subtle or dramatic ways. Intimidate lowered opponents' attack on entry, making certain started Pokemon excellent leads. Sturdy prevented one-hit knockouts, allowing fragile Pokemon to survive otherwise lethal hits. Rain Dish and similar abilities interacted with weather conditions, creating synergies between team members and battlefield states. These abilities encouraged players to think beyond simple type matchups, to consider how different Pokemon supported each other, how team composition could create advantages beyond individual power. Weather conditions became central to competitive strategy in ways they hadn't been before. Abilities like Drought and Drizzle automatically set weather upon entry, enabling entire team archetypes built around sunny day or rain strategies. Kyogre and Groudon themselves had these abilities, making them not just powerful legendary Pokemon, but enablers of specific playstyles. Sun teams built around chlorophyll sweepers, rain teams utilizing swift swim attackers. These became viable competitive strategies that required specific counters and careful play to overcome. The secret base system tapped into players' desire for personalization and creativity. Scattered throughout Hoenn were trees, indentations and cliffs, and hidden spots where players could establish their own bases. Using items collected through exploration, trainers could decorate these spaces, creating personalized hideouts that reflected the individual tastes. Friends could visit these bases via link cable or through mixing records, battling the NPC versions of each other and exploring how others had designed their spaces. This social feature encouraged sharing and comparison, gave players creative outlet beyond simply building strong teams. Ruby and Sapphire also introduced double battles, encounters where each side used two Pokemon simultaneously. This seemingly simple variation fundamentally changed battle strategy, requiring players to consider not just individual matchups, but how their Pokemon worked together. Moves gained new utility in double battles, spread moves hit multiple targets, support moves could benefit partners, and positioning became important in ways single battles never required. The format would eventually become central to competitive Pokemon, but even in its introduction, it added variety and forced players to think differently about team composition. The Pokemon contests offered an alternative to battling, a way for Pokemon to shine that didn't depend on power or type advantages. Trainers could enter their Pokemon in contests focused on different attributes like coolness, beauty, or cuteness. Success depended on teaching Pokemon specific moves, feeding them berries that enhanced contest stats, and performing well in rhythm-based minigames. This system acknowledged that not all Pokemon were designed for battle, gave players who preferred collecting and bonding over competitive battling something meaningful to pursue. Emerald version, released in 2004, refined and expanded the Hoenn experience. The Battle Frontier added challenging post-game content that pushed even experienced trainers to their limits. Different facilities tested different skills. The Battle Tower evaluated pure team strength. The Battle Factory forced players to use rental Pokemon. The Battle Pyramid combined exploration with battles in a dungeon-like structure. Each facility offered unique rewards and challenged players to adapt their strategies, to think beyond the teams that carried them through the main story. The expanded Rayquaza storyline in Emerald gave the legendary dragon a proper role in the narrative, positioning it as the mediator between Groudon and Kyogre. Catching Rayquaza atop the Sky Pillar became one of the generation's most memorable moments, climbing through a tower that required careful navigation, facing a legendary that represented balance and resolution. The encounter felt earned, felt meaningful in ways that simply stumbling across a legendary in a cave couldn't match. As we continue drifting through the generations, observe how Hoenn established patterns that future games would build upon. The increased narrative focus, the integration of legendary Pokémon into story events, the willingness to experiment with new battle formats and alternative gameplay modes, all of these choices expanded what a Pokémon game could be. The generation proved that the formula was flexible enough to accommodate different regional identities, different thematic focuses, different approaches to structure and progression. The fourth generation represented another leap forward in technology and ambition. The Nintendo DS brought dual screens and touch capabilities, opening possibilities for interface design and gameplay innovation that hadn't existed before. When Pokémon Diamond and Pearl released in Japan in 2006, they took full advantage of this new hardware, while deepening the mythological foundations that had been present but understated in previous games. Sinnoh felt ancient in ways that previous regions hadn't, its landscape marked by mountains and lakes that suggested geological timescales beyond human reckoning. Mount Coronet dominated the region, a massive peak that trainers had to traverse multiple times, its caves connecting disparate areas and hiding secrets in their depths. The lakes scattered across Sinnoh, each one home to a legendary guardian, felt sacred, places where myth and reality intersected. The region's design encouraged verticality, routes that climbed and descended, caves that delved deep into mountains, a sense that exploration meant moving through layers of history. The mythology of Sinnoh was perhaps the most ambitious the series had attempted. The creation trio, Dialga, Palkia, and Giratina, represented fundamental aspects of reality itself. Dialga controlled time, Palkia controlled space, and Giratina inhabited an antimatter realm where the rules of normal existence didn't apply. Above them all was Arceus, described in ancient texts as the Pokémon that created the universe that brought everything into being from nothing. This wasn't just world building, it was the series engaging with cosmology and mythology in ways that previous games had only hinted at. The Lake Guardians, Uxie, Mesprit, and Azelf represented knowledge, emotion, and willpower, respectively. These concepts tied to human consciousness itself, suggesting that the legendary Pokémon weren't just powerful beings, but fundamental aspects of existence and awareness. The games explored these ideas through the villainous Team Galactic, whose leader Cyrus sought to create a new universe free from emotion and conflict. This philosophical threat, the idea that someone might reshape reality according to their vision, raised stakes beyond simple world domination schemes. Sinnoh introduced 107 new Pokémon, including numerous evolutions for creatures from previous generations. Electivire and Magmortar gave final forms to lines that had felt incomplete. Togekiss elevated Togetic into a graceful fairy tale creature. Mamoswine brought Swinub's line into viability with powerful stats and excellent typing. These cross-generational evolutions suggested that the Pokémon world was still revealing secrets, that creatures players thought they understood completely, had hidden potential waiting to be discovered. The physical special split fundamentally changed how battles worked, addressing a limitation that had existed since the series began. Previously, move damage type was determined by the move's type. All fighting moves were physical, all ghost moves were special. The split separated this, making each individual move either physical or special based on the actual attack being performed. This change meant that Pokémon with high physical attack could finally use physical water moves, that special attackers could use special fighting moves, that team building became about matching moves to stats rather than working around arbitrary type restrictions. This Seemingly technical change had profound impacts on the metagame. Pokemon that had been limited by their typing suddenly became viable. New move pool options opened strategic possibilities that hadn't existed before, and battles became more about understanding individual Pokemon rather than making assumptions based on type. The change was so successful that it became hard to remember how battles had worked before, so natural that it felt like correcting an obvious error rather than implementing new mechanics. The Underground Network added a multiplayer dimension that took advantage of the DS's wireless capabilities. Players could dig for fossils and items, create secret bases in the tunnels beneath Sinnoh, and interact with other trainers who were also exploring underground. The minigames were simple, capturing flags from other bases, laying traps to slow down invaders, but the sense of a shared underground space where players could encounter each other created community even when playing alone. It was a quiet, low-key social feature that didn't demand attention but rewarded engagement. The Platinum version, released in 2008, refined Sinnoh while expanding Giratina's role and introducing the Distortion world. This bizarre realm, where gravity worked inconsistently and geometry defied normal rules, became one of the most memorable locations in the series. Navigating its twisted platforms and waterfall staircases while pursuing Cyrus and Giratina created moments of genuine disorientation and wonder. The visual design pushed the DS hardware, creating spaces that felt alien and wrong in ways that emphasized how fundamentally different the Distortion world was from normal reality. The Battle Frontier returned in Platinum, bringing with it the challenging facilities that had defined Emerald's post-game. But Platinum went further, adding more depth to character storylines, giving gym leaders personalities beyond simply being obstacles to overcome, creating a Sinnoh that felt more lived in and complete. The additions weren't just content for content's sake, they were refinements that made the region more cohesive and the experience more satisfying. Slowly, the story widens as we approach the 5th generation, watching how each new region built upon foundations laid by previous games while finding its own voice. The pattern had established itself by now. New hardware brought new possibilities. Each generation introduced new Pokémon and mechanics, and core gameplay remained recognizable while evolving in subtle ways. Players knew what to expect from a new Pokémon game, but also anticipated surprises, innovations that would change how they thought about training and battling. The 5th generation marked a deliberate break from established patterns, a decision to start fresh that both excited and concerned longtime fans. When Pokémon Black and White released in Japan in 2010, they featured an entirely new regional Pokédex with 0 Pokémon from previous generations available until after completing the main story. This was controversial, forcing players to abandon familiar favorites and build teams from creatures they'd never used before. But it was also refreshing, recapturing some of the discovery and experimentation that defined everyone's first Pokémon game. Unova felt distinctly different from previous regions, inspired by New York City and the surrounding areas rather than Japanese geography. The urban density, the bridges connecting different areas, the subway system that served as fast travel, all contributed to a more modern, metropolitan atmosphere. Castelia City, in particular, felt massive, a sprawling urban center with skyscrapers and crowded streets that dwarfed any city in previous games. The scale suggested that the Pokémon world wasn't just rural routes and small towns, that major population centers existed where humans and Pokémon coexisted in dense, complex ways. The seasonal cycle added another dimension to exploration and collecting. Different seasons brought different wild Pokémon, changed the appearance of routes, and opened or blocked access to certain areas. This encouraged players to return to familiar locations throughout the year to see how spring's flowers gave way to summer's lush growth, how autumn's falling leaves preceded winter's snow and ice. The cycle made the world feel more dynamic, more alive, suggested that time passed and things changed even in a digital realm. Unova introduced 156 new Pokémon, the largest number since the first generation. This massive roster included parallels to classic creatures, new takes on familiar concepts that allowed the all-new regional Pokédex to feel complete. There were new rodents and birds in early routes, new three-stage evolution lines for grass, fire, and water types beyond the starters, new legendary trios and duos that followed established patterns while introducing new designs and concepts. The sheer number of new creatures meant that even experienced players constantly encountered unfamiliar species, had to learn new type combinations, and battle strategies. The starter trio of Snivy, Tepig, and Oshawott evolved into Serperior, Embor, and Samurott, each with distinct design philosophies. Serperior's regal elegance, Embor's combination of fire and fighting types, Samurott's samurai aesthetic. These final forms reflected different approaches to power and battle. The designs sparked debates about whether starters should be cute or cool, whether certain type combinations were overused, whether humanoid or animalistic forms were more appealing. These debates themselves demonstrated how invested players were in Pokémon design, how much individual preferences and aesthetics mattered to team building. The story in Black and White was arguably the most complex and morally ambiguous the series had attempted. Team Plasma claimed to fight for Pokémon liberation, arguing that humans enslaved creatures for their own benefit, that the entire practice of catching and training Pokémon was inherently exploitative. Their leader N had been raised among abused Pokémon, genuinely believed that separation was the only ethical path forward. This wasn't a simple evil team with obviously wrong goals. It was a philosophical challenge that forced players to consider the ethics of their own actions. The game ultimately sided with the player's perspective, arguing that bonds between Pokémon and trainers could be based on mutual respect and genuine friendship rather than exploitation. But it acknowledged the question, gave N sympathetic characterization, and suggested that not all trainers treated their Pokémon well. This narrative complexity elevated the story beyond previous games' simpler good versus evil frameworks, created space for players to engage with themes rather than just progressing through plot beats. The moving sprites during battle represented a significant visual upgrade, making battles feel more dynamic even though they remained turn-based. Pokémon shifted and breathed and reacted to being hit, bringing life to combat that had been static since the series began. The improved animation didn't change how battles worked mechanically, but it changed how they felt, made victories more satisfying and defeats more impactful. Combined with more cinematic camera angles and dramatic music, battles in Black and White felt more important, more meaningful. The introduction of triple and rotation battles expanded on the double battle format, introduced in Generation 3. Triple battles allowed 6 Pokémon on screen simultaneously, with positional considerations determining which Pokémon could target which opponents. Rotation battles let trainers switch between 3 Pokémon instantly without losing a turn, creating a different kind of prediction game. These formats saw limited adoption compared to singles and doubles, but they demonstrated willingness to experiment with battle structure, to explore different ways trainers might command multiple Pokémon simultaneously. Black and White 2, released in 2012, represented the first direct sequels in mainline Pokémon games. Rather than being enhanced versions of the original games, they continued the story 2 years later, showing how Unova and its characters had changed. Former champion Iris appeared as a gym leader in the sequels, new areas opened for exploration, and the consequences of Black and White's events shaped the current state of the region. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed drifting through these quiet facts, there's another video waiting on the left of your screen. Maybe let it play while you rest. You might learn something new before you drift off again.